As the auction unfolded, Harold Devereux's heart pounded in his chest, his eyes glued to the stage as each bid for Elijah's work soared higher than he could have ever anticipated. His initial doubts about Elijah's place in the gallery had been swept away in a flood of excitement. The young artist's works, so raw and unrefined by traditional standards, had captivated the crowd, pushing the limits of what Harold thought was possible. It started with The Dreamer's Path, which had already surpassed all expectations, quickly climbing to an astounding $15 million. Harold had watched in stunned silence as the gavel fell on the sale of the piece, sending ripples of shock and awe through the room. The excitement didn't stop there. Each subsequent piece by Elijah was treated with the same level of reverence. Roots of Resilience, a powerful portrayal of a woman standing strong against a turbulent storm, sold for $18 million, while Eclipsed Horizons, a vibrant and chaotic portrayal of a figure caught in an emotional whirlwind, fetched $20 million. The bidding wars were relentless. The room was alive with energy, and the prices continued to escalate beyond Harold's wildest dreams. Harold couldn't quite believe it. His mind kept racing as the room buzzed with energy. The traditional works, those from established, long-standing names, hadn't even come close to matching the energy surrounding Elijah's paintings. Even pieces that had been in the gallery for years, some of which were considered top-tier works, were overshadowed by the demand for Elijah's raw, emotional art. With every new bid, Harold's disbelief grew. This is unreal, he thought. How could his work, this work, be fetching prices like this? But the true shock came when The Dreamer's Ascent, the last piece from Elijah's collection, was called to the stage. It was a monumental piece, a portrayal of a young child reaching up toward the moon, surrounded by a swirling pattern of stars and light. The symbolism was clear, a reflection of the desire for something greater, for hope, for future generations. This was Elijah's most ambitious piece yet. The auctioneer's voice rang through the room, the energy building as the crowd prepared for another round of fierce bidding. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have The Dreamer's Ascent by Elijah Mercer, the auctioneer announced. Starting bid, $10 million. The room fell silent for a moment. Then, the first paddle shot up. $10 million, came the bid. The auctioneer smiled, and Harold's nerves were already on edge. He had anticipated this piece might break records too, but nothing had prepared him for what happened next. The bidding started, and it escalated with such speed that Harold's head spun. $12 million, came the next paddle. $15 million, another voice joined in. $18 million. A third bidder raised their paddle, intensifying the bidding war. Harold's mind raced as the auctioneer called the numbers. One by one, the other pieces from Elijah's collection were called to the stage. The auctioneer had barely finished announcing one lot before the bidding began for the next. Roots of Resilience, Eclipsed Horizons, and The Dreamer's Ascent all followed, each one selling for record-breaking amounts. The auction, which Harold had assumed would be a mix of traditional works and a few experimental pieces, had been completely taken over by Elijah's art. As the gavel fell on Elijah's final piece, the room buzzed with excitement. The total sales for Elijah's works alone had shattered every expectation, bringing in over $50 million in just a few hours. But the revelation didn't stop there. The auctioneer, after the final bid had been placed, turned toward the crowd with a smile that seemed to carry the weight of a monumental truth. Before we conclude tonight, the auctioneer began, I want to take a moment to recognize the extraordinary contributions of one of our most influential guests this evening. Not only has Mr. Elijah Mercer's work set new records here tonight, but Mr. Mercer has also been a key buyer at this auction. The room fell silent. Elijah Mercer, it turned out, wasn't just a rising artist. He was also a major player in the art investment world, having quietly purchased several works throughout the evening on behalf of a collective of investors. The auctioneer continued, Mr. Mercer and his collective represent a new wave of art investors who understand the power of supporting emerging artists. Their involvement in tonight's event has played a key role in making this auction a resounding success. Harold stood at the back of the room, stunned. He had thought Elijah's participation in the auction was a gamble, an attempt to diversify the offerings. But Elijah had done more than that. He had completely redefined the evening. His artwork had become the focal point of the event, and his influence as a buyer had transformed the entire auction. Harold, once the gatekeeper of the space, now realized that the future of the art world was in the hands of artists like Elijah Mercer, those who didn't just create, but who had the power to change the very systems that governed the industry. The evening ended with applause for Elijah, and Harold's once confident grasp on the art world seemed to slip, replaced by a profound sense of humility. What he had witnessed was not just a success, it was a revolution. Elijah Mercer had not only sold his work for millions, but he had set the tone for the next era of art collecting and investment. Harold had no choice but to acknowledge it. The world was changing, and Elijah was leading the charge. As the night wore on, Harold realized he wasn't just a spectator to history, he was watching the future unfold before him. Also re-established Devereux Gallery as a forward-thinking space. The solution, he thought, was an exclusive high-profile auction. It would showcase the works of celebrated artists, while introducing new talent that had the potential to reinvigorate the market. Harold put all his efforts into curating a collection of pieces that balanced tradition with modernity. But what he didn't realize was that the one piece he was counting on to be the star of the auction, the one piece that would shift the entire course of the event, was already on his list. Harold had invited Elijah Mercer to be part of the auction, but it was meant to be a small gesture. He figured Elijah's work might bring in some attention from younger buyers, but Harold couldn't imagine it commanding the kind of prices his traditional collectors favored. The raw, emotionally charged style of Elijah's paintings, he assumed, was a niche that could only appeal to a limited audience. And while Elijah's rise on social media had been notable, it was still early days for the young artist. What Harold didn't know, however, was that Elijah's work was already a sensation. In the months leading up to the auction, Elijah's paintings had continued to gain recognition in online art circles. His works were consistently featured on prestigious social media pages and art blogs, and collectors began to take notice. As the auction approached, Elijah's name had spread beyond the digital realm. His reputation now reached the ears of some of the most influential collectors in the art world. Despite his doubts, Harold had included Elijah's paintings in the auction. But as the day of the event drew closer, he remained unaware that these pieces would become the centerpiece of the entire evening. The night of the auction arrived, and the Grand Meridian Hotel was abuzz with excitement. Harold walked into the vast ballroom, his heart racing with anticipation. The room was a glittering sea of wealthy patrons, collectors, and curators, all eager to add to their private collections. The art was displayed with precision, each piece expertly lit and framed, ready for its moment in the spotlight. Champagne flutes clinked as guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries and sizing up their potential acquisitions. Harold moved through the crowd, greeting old friends and making introductions. His nerves were palpable, but he tried to hide it behind a smile. This auction was the lifeblood of Devereux Gallery, and he needed it to succeed, desperately. He could feel the weight of his own expectations, hoping the pieces he had carefully chosen would fetch the prices needed to save his gallery's future. He had high hopes for some of the traditional works by established artists, but his mind kept drifting to Elijah's pieces. Will they sell? Will they be the right fit? He thought, feeling a slight unease. Finally, the auction began. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional, also re-established Devereux Gallery as a forward-thinking space. The solution, he thought, was an exclusive high-profile auction. It would showcase the works of celebrated artists, while introducing new talent that had the potential to reinvigorate the market. Harold put all his efforts into curating a collection of pieces that balanced tradition with modernity. But what he didn't realize was that the one piece he was counting on to be the star of the auction, the one piece that would shift the entire course of the event, was already on his list. Harold had invited Elijah Mercer to be part of the auction, but it was meant to be a small gesture. He figured Elijah's work might bring in some attention from younger buyers, but Harold couldn't imagine it commanding the kind of prices his traditional collectors favored. The raw, emotionally charged style of Elijah's paintings, he assumed, was a niche that could only appeal to a limited audience. And while Elijah's rise on social media had been notable, it was still early days for the young artist. What Harold didn't know, however, was that Elijah's work was already a sensation. In the months leading up to the auction, Elijah's paintings had continued to gain recognition in online art circles. His works were consistently featured on prestigious social media pages and art blogs, and collectors began to take notice. As the auction approached, Elijah's name had spread beyond the digital realm. His reputation now reached the ears of some of the most influential collectors in the art world. Despite his doubts, Harold had included Elijah's paintings in the auction. But as the day of the event drew closer, he remained unaware that these pieces would become the centerpiece of the entire evening. The night of the auction arrived, and the Grand Meridian Hotel was abuzz with excitement. Harold walked into the vast ballroom, his heart racing with anticipation. The room was a glittering sea of wealthy patrons, collectors, and curators, all eager to add to their private collections. The art was displayed with precision, each piece expertly lit and framed, ready for its moment in the spotlight. Champagne flutes clinked as guests mingled, exchanging pleasantries and sizing up their potential acquisitions. Harold moved through the crowd, greeting old friends and making introductions. His nerves were palpable, but he tried to hide it behind a smile. This auction was the lifeblood of Devereux Gallery, and he needed it to succeed, desperately. He could feel the weight of his own expectations, hoping the pieces he had carefully chosen would fetch the prices needed to save his gallery's future. He had high hopes for some of the traditional works by established artists, but his mind kept drifting to Elijah's pieces. Will they sell? Will they be the right fit? He thought, feeling a slight unease. Finally, the auction began. The auctioneer, a seasoned professional. The success didn't stop there. Elijah's art began to be featured in prestigious galleries and auction houses, and his works were snapped up by collectors from all over the world. His paintings, once dismissed as too raw or too emotional by the traditional art institutions, were now considered some of the most valuable contemporary works in the market. But Elijah knew that his success wasn't just about the art, it was about the movement he had started. Through social media, he had built a platform where voices like his could finally be heard, where the stories of marginalized communities could be told and celebrated. He had proven that art wasn't just for the elite. It was for everyone, and it had the power to change the world. Elijah's journey had begun with rejection, but now, he stood at the pinnacle of success, his art, his voice, and his story all validated by the very world that had once ignored him. And he knew this was only the beginning. He had proven that when you create with authenticity, when you stay true to your vision, there is nothing that can hold you back. The success didn't stop there. Elijah's art began to be featured in prestigious galleries and auction houses, and his works were snapped up by collectors from all over the world. His paintings, once dismissed as too raw or too emotional by the traditional art institutions, were now considered some of the most valuable contemporary works in the market. But Elijah knew that his success wasn't just about the art, it was about the movement he had started. Through social media, he had built a platform where voices like his could finally be heard, where the stories of marginalized communities could be told and celebrated. He had proven that art wasn't just for the elite. It was for everyone, and it had the power to change the world. Elijah's journey had begun with rejection, but now, he stood at the pinnacle of success, his art, his voice, and his story all validated by the very world that had once ignored him. And he knew this was only the beginning. He had proven that when you create with authenticity, when you stay true to your vision, there is nothing that can hold you back. Devereux Gallery had long been a symbol of prestige, a pillar of the city's art world. But recently, its shine had dulled. The art market had shifted, and the old-world style of collecting that had once filled Harold Devereux's coffers was losing its appeal. The established buyers who had frequented his gallery were no longer the ones setting trends. Younger collectors, more interested in modern and emotionally charged works, were now looking elsewhere. Even the well-established artists whose works once commanded hefty prices were beginning to fade in relevance. Desperate to restore the gallery's prominence and ensure its survival, Harold knew he had to make a bold move. He had to host an event that would not only fill the gallery's coffers, but he told stories of his neighborhood, of the people who had shaped his life, and of the experiences that had defined him as an artist. His paintings, full of vibrant color and raw emotion, depicted powerful images of strength, struggle, and hope. They were more than just paintings, they were windows into his world, and Elijah believed that if he could reach the right people, they would see the beauty in them too. At first, the response was slow. There were days when he would post his work and see little engagement, only a few likes, maybe a comment or two. But Elijah was undeterred. He continued to post, learning more about how to engage with his growing audience, and refining his approach. Slowly, his following grew, from a handful of friends to hundreds, then thousands. The turning point came when Elijah's work was featured on a prominent Instagram page that celebrated emerging artists. The post, which showcased his painting Roots of Resilience, went viral. The image, depicting a black woman standing tall in the face of a storm, captured something raw and beautiful that resonated with a wide audience. The hashtag Black Art Matters began circulating, and more people began to take notice of Elijah's work. His follower count exploded as people from all over the world connected with his art. It wasn't just black people, it was people of all races, backgrounds, and experiences. They saw themselves in his paintings. Soon, Elijah's work began to attract attention from art collectors who had previously dismissed him. He was invited to be part of online exhibitions and to participate in digital art shows that celebrated emerging talent. And as his reputation grew, so did the value of his art. His first major sale came from Roots of Resilience, which sold for $40,000 to a private collector who had seen it online. The money was a validation, but it was also a reminder that his work had real value. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the respect, the recognition, and the validation from a world that had once closed its doors to him. Elijah's breakthrough came when his piece The Dreamer's Path was selected for a prestigious online auction hosted by a well-known art platform. This auction was notorious for attracting high-profile collectors, curators, and critics, and Elijah was both nervous and excited. This was his chance to prove that his work wasn't just a fluke, that he had the talent, the vision, and the passion to compete with the biggest names in the art world. When The Dreamer's Path was auctioned off, it sold for $1.2 million, an amount that completely shattered Elijah's expectations. The sale was more than just a financial milestone, it was the moment that Elijah realized he had truly broken through the glass ceiling of the art world. His work was no longer relegated to social media or niche digital exhibitions. It had entered the mainstream and the world was taking notice. But for Elijah, it wasn't academics or a traditional career path that caught his attention, it was art. From a young age, he had an innate talent for capturing the world around him. He would spend hours drawing in his notebook, sketching the faces of people in his neighborhood, their stories, their struggles, and their resilience. Art became his language, his way of expressing everything he couldn't say with words. It was his escape and his form of protest, a way to reflect on the beauty of life amid hardship, and to explore the complexities of his identity. Despite the encouragement of his parents, who supported his creative interests, the road to recognition was anything but easy. Growing up in a working-class neighborhood, Elijah didn't have access to the expensive art schools or elite mentors that could launch a successful career in the art world. His community, though rich with culture and life, lacked the resources to nurture young talent in the way that prestigious institutions could. Elijah knew he had talent, but the art world, as he would soon discover, was not as open to people like him. The first rejection came when Elijah applied to a renowned art school in New York, hoping to gain the formal education that would take his art to the next level. He poured his heart into his application, submitting a portfolio filled with his most meaningful pieces, paintings that captured the essence of his neighborhood, his family, and the broader Black experience. He waited anxiously for the response, knowing that this could be the breakthrough he had long dreamed of. When the rejection letter arrived, it stung. The letter was polite, filled with the typical language of raw potential and not yet refined enough. But Elijah read between the lines, he knew what they were really saying. His art, the art that told stories of identity, resilience, and the struggles of Black life, wasn't what they were looking for. It wasn't refined enough. He wasn't the kind of artist they expected to see in their halls. That rejection didn't stop Elijah. If anything, it fueled his determination. The art world might have closed its doors to him, but he refused to let that define him. If the galleries and schools wouldn't accept him, he would find another way. Elijah quickly realized that the traditional paths to success in the art world were not meant for someone like him. But as technology advanced and social media began to take off, a new avenue opened up. Elijah wasn't the first artist to turn to platforms like Instagram, but he quickly saw that it offered a way to bypass the gatekeepers of the traditional art world. If he could put his art directly in front of people, he could make his own audience. His art could speak for itself, he just needed to find the right people who would see it. He began posting his work regularly on Instagram, each post accompanied by a caption that described the story behind the painting. This looks like something someone might put up in a local cafe or a community center. There's no real polish here. Elijah's heart sank. He had anticipated rejection, but not this level of disdain. Harold continued flipping through the portfolio, his eyes not really seeing the paintings, but instead focusing on Elijah. His tone grew dismissive as he muttered, "This kind of work might fly in a different venue, but it's not what we're about here. Our clients expect pieces with a pedigree. These pieces, they just don't measure up. You might want to try a smaller gallery, or perhaps sell your work at a local show. It's not the kind of thing that belongs in a space like this." Elijah stood frozen for a moment, the sting of the words settling in like a weight in his chest. He had heard this before, heard it in the cold dismissals and closed doors. He had fought his whole life against a system that judged his worth based on his appearance, his background, and his identity. He had fought to get here, to this moment, and now, standing in front of Harold Devereux, he realized that even in the world of art, the rules were rigged against people like him. But Elijah wasn't about to let this man's dismissive words define him. His art had meaning, it had power, and it deserved to be seen. He had worked too hard to be deterred by someone who couldn't see beyond his own prejudices. "I understand," Elijah said quietly, his voice calm, despite the hurt he felt. He closed the portfolio with purpose, tucking it under his arm. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Devereux." Without waiting for a response, Elijah turned and walked out of the gallery, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft thud. He felt humiliated, his confidence shaken by the harshness of the rejection, but there was something else in him, something that burned brighter than the sting of rejection: determination. Elijah knew the art world wouldn't welcome him with open arms. He knew that people like Harold, with their elitist views, would always look down on artists like him. But what they didn't understand was that his art wasn't just for them. It was for the people who had been overlooked, the stories that had been ignored. And he would find a way to make sure the world saw it. He would prove Harold wrong. Elijah Mercer's story began in a small, working-class neighborhood, a place where dreams were often stifled by harsh realities. Born to immigrant parents who worked tirelessly to make a life in the United States, Elijah's early years were shaped by sacrifice, perseverance, and a deep desire for something more. His father worked in a factory, often putting in long hours, while his mother worked as a nurse at a local hospital, her hands worn from the physical labor of caring for others. Though their jobs kept them busy, they always made sure their children understood the value of education and hard work. Elijah Mercer stood at the front door of Devereux Gallery, feeling both excitement and apprehension swirl within him. This was a turning point, his chance to introduce his work to one of the most prestigious galleries in the city. He had spent months perfecting his portfolio, meticulously choosing pieces that captured his voice, his truth. The paintings were full of emotion, bold colors, raw lines, and powerful imagery that spoke to resilience, identity, and the struggles of a community often left unheard. For Elijah, this moment was more than just an opportunity to showcase his work, it was his chance to be seen and respected in a world that often ignored artists like him. The gallery stood before him like a monument to success. Its gleaming glass doors, white marble floors, and quiet sophistication exuded an air of exclusivity. This was the kind of place that displayed art for collectors who could afford to pay millions for a single painting. But it was also a space where names were made, where young artists gained recognition, or were shut out entirely. Elijah took a deep breath and pushed the door open. The bell above the door chimed softly as he stepped into the cool, air-conditioned space. The soft hum of classical music played in the background, setting a calm and elegant atmosphere. He was greeted by a young assistant who led him toward the back office where Harold Devereux, the gallery owner, sat behind a large, polished desk. Harold was a man who carried the air of someone who had seen it all, someone who didn't have time for anything that didn't meet his exacting standards. "Mr. Devereux," Elijah said, extending his hand. His voice was steady, though his heart raced with anticipation. Harold barely looked up from his papers as he shook Elijah's hand, offering a brief, disinterested glance. "What can I do for you?" he asked, his tone flat. "I'm an artist," Elijah replied, "and I'd like to discuss the possibility of showcasing my work here at the gallery. I've brought a portfolio of my pieces. I believe they could be a good fit for your collection." Harold leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over Elijah's appearance, his modest suit, his dark skin, his confident yet unpolished demeanor. Harold's eyes flicked to the portfolio Elijah held tightly in his hands, and without a word, he motioned for Elijah to set it down. Elijah opened the portfolio slowly, revealing his paintings, each piece brimming with life, color, and emotion. There were portraits of people from his community, mothers, fathers, children, all rendered in vivid colors, capturing the strength of everyday lives, the beauty in moments that often went unnoticed. Harold glanced at the first few pages, barely giving them a cursory look, before his expression hardened. "This is your work?" He raised an eyebrow in apparent disbelief. "It's a bit unrefined. You know, our gallery tends to focus on pieces with more sophistication." Each bid increased by millions, until finally, the hammer fell. $35 million, the auctioneer announced, his voice full of reverence. "Sold." The crowd erupted into applause, but Harold stood frozen in place. $35 million? He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The final bid had far exceeded any expectations. Elijah's work had not only dominated the evening, it had shattered every record Harold had set for his gallery. He couldn't comprehend it. This wasn't just a successful auction, it was a cultural moment. Elijah's works had taken the spotlight, and the art world would never be the same. But the surprises weren't over. As the applause began to die down, the auctioneer raised his hand, preparing to announce the next item. Then he paused and looked out over the crowd, his eyes scanning the room. "I'd like to take a moment," the auctioneer said, his voice gaining a sense of importance, "to acknowledge a key figure in tonight's event. Mr. Elijah Mercer, who not only had his work sell for record-breaking prices, but who has also been a major buyer throughout this evening." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Harold's stomach dropped. What was this? The auctioneer continued, his voice carrying across the room. "Mr. Mercer has been acquiring works not only from his own collection but has also purchased several top lots on behalf of a collective of investors who share his vision for the future of art. These investors believe in the value of new voices, and Mr. Mercer's leadership in this auction has truly set the stage for a new era in art collecting." The room fell into stunned silence. Harold's mind raced as the realization hit him. Elijah was more than just an artist. He was a major player in the art market. The young man who had once been dismissed by Harold was now buying up works from some of the top artists of the evening. Elijah wasn't just participating in the auction, he was shaping its outcome, guiding the direction of the market itself. The auctioneer continued, "Mr. Mercer and his collective represent a new wave of collectors who value innovation, authenticity, and inclusivity. They are redefining what it means to invest in art." Harold felt a chill run down his spine. He had invited Elijah to the auction, expecting his works to add some diversity to the collection, but he had never imagined the extent of Elijah's influence. Elijah was no longer just an artist, he was a leader, a visionary, and a driving force in the transformation of the art world. Elijah, calm and collected, stood in the back of the room, his expression serene but with a quiet confidence that made him look like he had always belonged here. The realization hit Harold hard. Elijah wasn't just participating in this world, he was reshaping it. As the evening drew to a close, Harold watched in awe as the guests, curators, and collectors all gathered around Elijah. It was no longer just about the art. It was about the collective power that Elijah represented. He had not only taken the art world by storm, but he had also become the key player in a market that was moving away from tradition and into a new, more inclusive future. Elijah wasn't just an artist who had succeeded against the odds, he had become a new kind of art mogul, one who was disrupting the old guard and shifting the focus to the voices that had long been excluded from the mainstream. As Harold stood in the back of the room, still absorbing the revelation, he realized that his assumptions about Elijah had been entirely wrong. The future of art wasn't in the hands of the established elite. It was in the hands of new voices, new artists, and new investors, people who didn't fit the old mold but who had the power to create something entirely new. Harold's world had just been upended. And in the wake of Elijah's success, Harold knew that his gallery, and the art world as a whole, would never be the same again. Elijah Mercer had not only proven his worth as an artist. He had shown the world that the future of art was about much more than just creating, it was about shaping the market, challenging the norms, and paving the way for a more inclusive, diverse, and innovative art world. And Harold was left to watch in awe as this new world began to unfold before him. The day after the auction, as the excitement began to settle and the reality of the night's events sank in, Harold Devereux found himself standing in the back office of his gallery, a place he had spent decades building into a well-respected institution in the art world. The once vibrant space that had hosted some of the most celebrated works of art now felt hollow, weighed down by the knowledge that his time in control was coming to an end. Elijah Mercer's art had not only dominated the auction, it had revolutionized the event. The record-breaking sales of his work were an undeniable testament to the power and influence of his voice in the art world. But it wasn't just the price tags that had changed the game, it was the way Elijah had taken control of the narrative. The art market had been shaken by the realization that the future of art was not only in the hands of established names and old institutions, but in the hands of new artists with fresh perspectives and bold, innovative ideas. What Harold didn't expect was the call that came the morning after the auction. "Elijah, it's a surprise to hear from you," Harold said as he picked up the phone, his voice carrying the fatigue of the long, tense night. "I imagine it is," Elijah replied, his tone steady but with an underlying warmth. "I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to showcase my work at your auction. I know you took a chance with me, and it paid off in ways I don't think either of us expected." Harold was about to reply, but Elijah continued before he could speak. "I'm calling because I want to make an offer. I'd like to purchase Devereux Gallery. The way things are going right now, you need someone who can push the gallery into the future. And I believe I can do that." Harold's breath caught in his throat. Purchase the gallery? The idea had never crossed his mind, not in a million years. He had spent years cultivating Devereux Gallery's reputation. The thought of selling it, especially to someone like Elijah, someone so new to the scene, was unsettling. But as Elijah continued speaking, Harold began to feel a sense of inevitability, like this was the only way forward. "I want to keep the name Devereux, but I want to transform it into something that represents the future of art," Elijah said, his voice firm but filled with vision. "A space where emerging and underrepresented artists can showcase their work, a space that challenges the status quo and reflects the diversity of the world around us." Harold felt a pang of uncertainty, but also an undeniable sense of relief. The financial burden of the gallery had weighed heavily on him, and Elijah's offer came at a time when his options were dwindling. Perhaps this was the change the gallery needed. The sale was finalized within weeks, and Devereux Gallery, now rebranded as the Horizon Collective, began its transformation. Elijah's vision was clear from the start: the Horizon Collective would be a space for the new generation of artists, those who had long been overlooked or excluded from traditional galleries. It was to be a place where artists like Elijah could thrive, where their voices could be heard, and where their work could be celebrated for its authenticity and power, not just for its ability to fit into an established mold. The gallery's walls, once filled with traditional, safe works designed to appeal to the elite, now held pieces bursting with energy and emotion. The color palette of the space shifted from muted neutrals to bold, vibrant hues that reflected the diverse voices of the artists Elijah sought to champion. Where once there were walls of polished, marketable art, now there were paintings and sculptures that told stories of struggle, identity, joy, and survival. The first exhibition at the Horizon Collective was called Voices of the Future. It featured works by emerging artists from marginalized communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, artists who had struggled to gain a foothold in the art world. The exhibition was a resounding success, with pieces selling at prices far higher than expected. But more importantly, the event made a statement. This was a gallery that represented something new, something that embraced the richness of the human experience without filtering it through the lens of tradition and privilege. The response to the gallery's new direction was overwhelming. Critics praised the bold shift in focus, and collectors who had previously shied away from non-traditional art found themselves drawn to the gallery's inclusive approach. Elijah's reputation continued to grow, but now he wasn't just known as an artist, he was recognized as a leader, an advocate for change, and a figurehead in the movement to reshape the art world. While Elijah had taken over the leadership of the gallery, Harold was not left behind. In the months following the sale, Elijah invited Harold to stay on as a mentor for the young artists who would now pass through the Horizon Collective. Harold, who had spent so many years in the art world as a gatekeeper, curating collections, making judgments about what was worthy of attention, now found himself in a new role. His years of experience were valuable, but Elijah's vision had shown him that the art world needed to evolve. He could no longer be the one making the decisions about what was acceptable or valuable. Instead, he became a guide, helping artists navigate the complexities of the industry without compromising their voices. "I'm not here to tell them how to make art," Harold said one day as he walked through the gallery with Elijah. "I'm here to help them make sure they're heard, to help them navigate the world you've opened up for them." Elijah nodded. "That's exactly what I want. You've spent a lifetime building this world. Now it's our turn to create something new." Under Elijah's leadership, the Horizon Collective became more than just a gallery, it became a movement. The artists who passed through its doors found not only a platform for their work, but also a community of support. The mentorship program that Harold had started allowed young, emerging artists to hone their craft, develop their voices, and find a place in the art world that embraced them for who they were. Elijah's emphasis on inclusion, empowerment, and authenticity resonated throughout the gallery's exhibitions, transforming it into a beacon of innovation. As the years passed, the Horizon Collective became one of the most influential art institutions in the world. Its focus on diverse and emerging artists didn't just change the careers of those involved, it changed the landscape of the art world itself. Galleries and auction houses that had once resisted change now sought to emulate Elijah's success, understanding that the future of art lay in embracing voices from all corners of society, not just the elite few. Harold, now a trusted advisor and mentor, watched as Elijah's vision continued to grow. The young artist had not only transformed a struggling gallery into a thriving institution, but had created a legacy that would shape the future of art for generations. Through the Horizon Collective, Elijah had proved that art wasn't just about preserving tradition, it was about pushing boundaries, breaking barriers, and making space for voices that had long been ignored. Together, Elijah and Harold had created something that would endure far beyond their own careers. It was a legacy of innovation, inclusivity, and a commitment to shaping a world where art was not just a commodity but a powerful force for change. As Elijah stood in the center of the gallery, surrounded by the work of so many talented, diverse artists, he couldn't help but smile. This was the future of art. And it was just beginning.